Jimin Kwan, Akshay Thakur.
They have recording permission.
Thank you so much.
You can go ahead and begin this round. Thank you.
All right, good morning. My name is Colin Powell. I'll be your presiding judge this morning. We'll go ahead and call into session the Circuit Court of the State of Midlands. I'll call the case Joey Petrillo as administrator of the estate of Genesis Petrillo versus Harper Martini and Peony Estates. Do we have counsel for each side present and ready to go?
Counsel for the plaintiff is ready to proceed, Your Honor.
Excellent.
Counsel for the defense is ready to proceed, Your Honor.
All right, let's have appearances from counsel, starting with the plaintiff.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. My name is Anaga Chandramoli, and today I, along with my co-counsel, Ms. Abia Bakai.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Morning.
And Mr. Darius Parak.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
Represent the estate of Genesis Petrillo in today's proceedings. And Your Honor, after the defense has a chance to introduce themselves, we do have some preliminary matters to get to prior to opening statements.
Very well. Let's hear from the defense first.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Sam Scheidler, and along with my co-counsel, Rachel Averett and Courtney Trigg, I represent the defendant, Harper Martini, in today's trial.
Very well. Good morning, everybody. Okay. Plaintiff, what pretrial matters do you have for the court?
Your Honor, we'd like the court to note we've pre-marked exhibits 1 through 24 for the court's convenience, and both parties have stipulated that exhibits 1 through 10 will be pre-admitted prior to beginning trial.
Very well. 1 to 10 are admitted.
Next, Your Honor, we'd like to invoke Midland's Rules of Evidence 603 and 615, which respectively swear in all witnesses constructively and constructively sequester all witnesses, barring party representatives. In today's case, the plaintiff will have no party representative.
Very well.
Finally, Your Honor, we'd like to know what your preferences are in terms of screen sharing, exhibits, and demonstratives. Would you like us to ask for permission or simply note our actions for the record?
Let's ask for permission the first time you do it, and then from there on, you'll have free reign.
Yes, Your Honor. With that, the plaintiff is ready to proceed.
Very well. Anything from the defense before we get started?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense at this time wishes to ask that all objection arguments be heard constructively out of earshot of the jury.
Yes.
Your Honor, we'd also like to ask your preferences as to striking evidence from the record that has been successfully objected to. Should we ask you whether you would like whether we can strike it from the record, or should we assume that it's automatically been stricken?
Can't assume anything in my court, sir. Go ahead and ask if you want it stricken.
Yes, Your Honor.
Oh, sir, you went on mute, Mr. Scheidler.
Sorry, Your Honor. The defense would also like to designate Harper Martini as its party representative at this time.
Very well. Mr. Martini may not be sequestered.
And with that, Your Honor, the defense is ready to proceed.
Excellent. Anything else before we start opening statement? Excuse me. All right, let's hear from the plaintiff.
May I proceed?
You may.
Remember the threats. Members of the jury, throughout today's trial, as you hear from different witnesses and experts, we ask that you keep one thing in mind: the threats that the defendant made to Genesis Petrillo. This case revolves around them, and the evidence will show that the defendant carried out these threats by poisoning Genesis Petrillo's wine. It's June 7th, 2019. Genesis Petrillo and Casey Soto's rehearsal dinner. Everyone at the event is thrilled to see them get married. Everyone except Mr. Petrillo's mother-in-law, the defendant, Harper Martini. You see, Miss Martini hated Genesis Petrillo. Genesis insulted her, her business, and threatened to take away her only child. Miss Martini was furious, desperate to get rid of Genesis in any way possible. She threatens Genesis multiple times, but Genesis doesn't listen. Miss Martini becomes obsessed. She even bribes Genesis with $300,000, but Genesis still won't leave. So the defendant did what she had to do. on the night of the rehearsal dinner, pretending to be a forgiving mother-in-law, brushing off her threats as family drama, the defendant gives Genesis a bottle of wine. Wine that the defendant has mixed with deadly pesticide. Poor, unsuspecting Genesis drinks this bottle of wine and dies of pesticide poisoning the very next morning, on what was supposed to be his wedding day. Members of the jury, that is why we are here today. We represent the victim, Genesis Petrio's family, and we have brought one claim of battery against Harper Martini, so we hold the burden of proof. We have to prove every element of battery by a preponderance of the evidence. All that means is at the end of today's trial, if you believe that it is more likely than not, that's just 51% likely, that the defendant poisoned Genesis Petrio, then we will have met our burden. And to do that, we will call 3 witnesses. First, you will hear from Angel Rodriguez, Mr. Petrio's close friend. Mr. Rodriguez will tell the court that on June 7th, he saw the defendant carrying pesticide to the kitchen, near where the wine is bottled. He will also tell the court that the defendant directly threatened Genesis. "I will take you out, the hard way." Next, Mr. Danny Francasio, the defendant's old boss and confidant, will take the stand and tell the court that Miss Martini was trained about how deadly pesticides are, and that the defendant threatened Genesis multiple times, at one point promising, "Only one of us will survive this wedding." Finally, you will hear from Dr. Jimin Kwan, a doctor experienced in toxicology, and the one who treated Genesis on the night of his death. He will testify that Mr. Petrio showed all the symptoms of pesticide poisoning, that pesticide was found in Mr. Petrio's stomach contents, and that Genesis Petrio's death was caused by pesticide poisoning. Members of the jury, remember the threats. They, along with the rest of the evidence, will show that the defendant intentionally poisoned Genesis Petrio. Therefore, at the conclusion of today's trial, my co-counsel, Mr. Dries Parak, will ask the court to hold the defendant liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Defense, are you ready to give your opening statement?
Yes, may I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
May it please the court. The plaintiff is telling a story with the wrong villain and the wrong ending. Members of the jury, when you hear a story, you expect it to have certain parts. It should have a hero and a villain, an exposition, a climax, and a resolution. And if it's a good story, members of the jury, the conclusion, the ending, will follow logically from the facts of the story. But today, the plaintiff is here to tell you a story. They're going to tell it in the form of a complaint, a civil complaint, a civil battery. That complaint has 3 central elements that they're going to discuss with you today. Members of the jury, they must prove to you that an act occurred, that act was intended to cause harm, and that the harm intended occurred to the victim of the act. Members of the jury, to put that in today's terms, they're here to allege that Harper Martini put organophosphate pesticide poisoning in the wine that she then gave to Genesis Petrio with the intent of killing or hurting Genesis Petrio, and that Genesis Petrio was harmed by the pesticide in that wine. Members of the jury, as you hear that story play out today, I want to ask you to think about who the plaintiff is making the villain of their story and how that story ends. I want you to ask yourself if the plaintiff is meeting their burden. Now, let's talk about that burden. The plaintiff comes before you today bearing the burden of proof, and they must prove their claim by a preponderance of the evidence. That means that they must prove each element of their charge to be more likely true than not. I want you to listen carefully to their story and ask yourself, is it more likely than not that Harper Martini is the villain of today's story? Is it more likely to be true than not that Genesis Petrio died of pesticide poisoning, that this story ends the way that the plaintiff does? Members of the jury, because the plaintiff bears the burden of proof in today's case, the defense is not obligated to provide you with a single piece of evidence. They're not obligated to provide you with a single piece of testimony. Members of the jury, if you hear the plaintiff's story and are not 100% satisfied that they meet their burden of proof, then you must find the defendant not liable. However, the defense is going to bring evidence today, and they're going to tell you just how the plaintiff's story doesn't add up. You're first going to hear about the ending of the plaintiff's story, and you're going to hear from Dr. Rose Cannon, who's going to come before you and tell you that the analysis conducted by Dr. Kwan, the expert that the plaintiff will call in today's case, doesn't provide scientific certainty about the ending of the plaintiff's story. She's going to explain that Dr. Kwan failed to consider a variety of alternative causes of death and conducted too few tests in too short of a time to conclude with scientific certainty that Genesis Petrillo died of pesticide poisoning. Members of the jury, if the plaintiff fails to prove with a preponderance of the evidence that Genesis Petrillo died from pesticide poisoning, you must find Harper Martini not liable. Next, the defense is going to show you that the plaintiff has simply selected the wrong villain in the telling of their story. You're going to hear from Casey Soto, Harper Martini's son and the bereaved fiance of Genesis Petrillo. Casey will admit that his mother can be a difficult person, that she has a hard time adapting to change, and that she certainly had a rough patch with Genesis Petrillo, but Casey's going to tell you that his mother would never hurt him by hurting someone that he loved. You're going to hear a lot of the same things from Harper Martini herself when the defense calls her to the stand. Harper's going to tell you that adjusting to Genesis was difficult and that she wasn't wild about who her son chose to marry, but members of the jury, Harper Martini will tell you that the thought of harming Genesis never crossed her mind, that she would never consider hurting the person most important to her, her son, Casey Soto, by hurting someone that he loved. And Harper's going to tell you something else. She's going to tell you about someone who worked at Peony Estates, an ex-lover of Casey Soto. She's going to tell you that while she doesn't know what happened to Genesis Petrillo, she does know that there was someone at Peony Estates who would want to hurt Casey and would want to hurt Genesis, who had access to the pesticide storage at Peony Estates and had access to the bottling area where wine and wine ingredients were stored. Members of the jury, at the end of the defense's testimony, it's going to be clear to you that the plaintiff has selected the wrong villain in telling their story. Now, at the end of today, my co-counsel, Rachel Avert, is going to come before you, and she's going to remind you of the burden of proof. She's going to remind you that the plaintiff is obligated to prove that each element of their charge is more likely to be true than not. She's going to ask you to once again think about who the villain of the plaintiff's story is and how their story ends, and she's going to ask you whether you can find it more likely true than not that the plaintiff has both elements of that story right. Members of the jury, after hearing today's evidence, you will have no choice but to conclude that it is not only unlikely, but implausible that Harper Martini is the villain of today's story, and you're going to find that there is simply no scientific certainty that the plaintiff has the end of their story correct.
Thank you. Is the plaintiff ready to present his case in chief?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Mr. Angel Rodriguez to the stand.
All right, Mr. Rodriguez.
May I proceed?
You may. Let's have the crossing attorney also turn on their camera, please.
May I proceed at this time?
Thank you. Yes, you may.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the court?
Hello, my name is Angel Rodriguez.
Mr. Rodriguez, what do you do for a living?
I'm a kindergarten teacher right here in Midlands.
Now, I want to talk to you about your relationship with Mr. Petrillo. Did you know him?
Yes, I met Genesis back in 2016 through a mutual friend, along with Casey Soto.
And how long have you guys been friends?
We hit it off right away, and we were close friends for 3 years.
Well, let's start at the beginning. When did Mr. Petrillo and Mr. Soto get engaged?
That was the summer of 2018.
What happened the night they got engaged?
A group of us celebrated by going to Casey's favorite place, a winery called Rosie and Pedro. By the end of the night, Casey and Genesis had decided every little detail about their wedding, right down to the I-dos. I was even going to be the best man.
Did those wedding plans stay the same?
Actually, no. Things started to change once Harper, Casey's mom, took control.
Mr. Rodriguez, what changed when Mr. Martini took control?
From what I observed while helping plan the wedding, a lot changed. For example, the venue was moved to Peony Estates, which is Harper's own winery. And she even hired her own wedding planner, and from then on, Harper and Genesis were constantly arguing.
Well, let's talk about the night of the wedding rehearsal dinner. Were Mr. Petrillo and the defendant arguing that evening as well?
Yes, Harper and Genesis would not stop fighting. At one point, Harper even told Genesis, "You should just leave and save this family the headache. Otherwise, I will make you disappear."
How did Genesis react to the defendant saying that she would make him disappear?
He confronted her, but she just pulled him out into the hallway.
Do you know what happened in the hall?
No. But when I saw Genesis afterwards, he seemed terrified.
Did you see the defendant after that?
Actually, yes. Later, I saw Harper in the hallway walking towards the kitchen with a can of pesticides.
Did you ask Miss Martini why she was carrying pesticide?
I did, and she said it was for pests, like Genesis. And when I stared at her, she just tried to play it off as some joke.
Well, Mr. Rodriguez, how did the rest of the evening go?
For a while, it was nice. We were all giving these charming toasts.
And how did the defendant treat Mr. Petrillo during their toast?
Harper started being weirdly nice, even giving Genesis this fancy bottle of Cara wine from Peony Estates.
Now, Mr. Rodriguez, did anyone else receive this bottle of Cara wine?
No. Genesis was the only one to receive it. Everyone else got different wine.
Based on what you saw, who drank from this bottle of Cara wine?
I know Genesis did. I tried it too, but it tasted awful, so I spat it out. Other than that, I don't know anyone else that had any of that wine.
Now, besides that bottle of Cara wine, how much did Genesis drink that night?
Genesis was drinking a lot less than normal. Usually when I party with him, he's had a lot more to drink without even getting hungover.
And what happened after Mr. Petrillo finished the bottle?
Around midnight or so, I noticed that Genesis was slumped over in his chair. I'd never seen him like that before, so I thought it would be a good idea to get him upstairs to get some rest before the big day tomorrow.
Do you know if he got any rest?
No. Once we got back to the room, Genesis was sweating profusely and even started vomiting. I mean, he was pale and looked lifeless.
Did you try to help him?
Of course I tried. I gave him water, but he couldn't keep it down. And the next thing I know, he passed out cold on the floor.
Mr. Rodriguez, who did you call for help?
I called 911 as fast as I could. An ambulance was there within minutes.
What did you do when the paramedics came?
I rushed them to Genesis, and they began performing CPR on him. But it wasn't working, so they had to take him to the hospital, but I couldn't leave his side, so I rode in the ambulance all the way there.
What did you do for the rest of the night?
I stayed in the hospital, hoping, praying that he would be okay.
Did you receive any updates on his condition?
Yes, at around 8 a.m., I was informed that Genesis had fallen into a coma, likely due to poisoning. I was in shock. I had to tell Casey.
How did you tell Casey?
I couldn't tell him over the phone. I needed to tell him in person, so I went back to Peony Estates.
What happened when you returned?
I was trying to look for Casey, and I bumped into Harper.
Did you talk to the defendant at all?
No, before I could say anything, Harper just said, "Genesis got poisoned. Oh no, we'll have to cancel the wedding."
Now, Mr. Rodriguez, had you told the defendant that Mr. Petrillo had been poisoned?
No, I don't know how she knew. I was the only one at the hospital.
What did you do after speaking with the defendant?
I went and told Casey, and he immediately wanted me to take him to the hospital.
What time did you arrive?
We got there at around 9:30 and rushed to Genesis's room.
Mr. Rodriguez, what was Genesis's condition when you got there?
By the time we got there, we were told that Genesis had just passed a few minutes prior. We missed it by only a few minutes. And that was the most heartbreaking moment of my life.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. No further questions.
Cross-examination, Ms. Trigg.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Good morning, Mr. Rodriguez.
Good morning.
I would like to first start off with some things you mentioned on your direct. Now, on June 7th, you saw Harper Martini carrying a bottle of pesticides. Is that correct?
Yes, Harper was carrying pesticides and walking towards the kitchen.
She was walking towards where you think is the kitchen, correct?
Yes, the kitchen in the rehearsal dinners.
But
hall.
you did not see her walk into the kitchen, did you?
Not right into it, but towards it.
You were also unaware of where she was coming from, is that correct?
Right, I just saw her in the hall.
Now let's move on to your relationship with Genesis. Now, you and Genesis were friends for 5 years.
No, not 5 years. We'd only known each other for 3 years.
For 3 years?
Yes.
You hadn't known Harper at all before the wedding, correct?
No, I'd only seen Harper a couple of times before the wedding.
Now let's move on to the wedding day or the rehearsal day. You sat next to Genesis, right?
I did. Genesis sat right next to me.
And you were there when wines and champagnes were passed out to the wedding party?
Yes, I was.
And you saw that she received the bottle of Cara.
Right, Genesis received a bottle of Cara wine, which no one else at the table got.
And you also took a sip, correct?
Right, Genesis offered me a sip, but it tasted off, so I did not swallow it.
Now you saw her pour 2 glasses, right?
Right, one for me and one for him.
But you did not drink that glass?
No, I just took a sip, but again, it was awful to me, so I spit it out.
So Genesis continued drinking the wine?
Yes, I don't like red wine, but Genesis drank the rest of it.
Now let's move on to the bar later that night. You, Genesis, Drew Matsuoka, and one other person were all at the bar, correct?
Yes, we were. We were talking and laughing.
And you were not paying attention to Genesis the entire time?
The entire time, no, but Genesis was right by me.
But you saw her order several tequila shots.
Yes, as a joke, Genesis ordered some tequila shots, but we ended up finishing them off. He didn't have any of them.
But you cannot say what he did or did not drink, can you?
Well, I know I didn't see him take a tequila shot.
No, throughout the entirety of the time at the bar, you cannot say what he did or did not drink, can you?
No, I wasn't watching him the whole time, so I don't know if he had anything to drink, but he was asleep, so I don't know.
He was asleep at the bar,
Yes, he fell asleep at the bar.
but prior to that, you did not see him drink or not drink anything.
Not that I can say, no.
And you were talking to Drew at the bar, correct?
Yes, I was talking to my other friend, Drew.
And you are aware that Drew has access to the entirety of the winery
I believe so, something like that.
since he is a tour guide at Peony Estates.
Right.
And he has access to the bottling area and all other procedural rooms.
Right, he has access to all those rooms, but that night he was just at the sweetheart table with me and Genesis and Casey in the wedding party.
So he had access to Genesis for the entirety of the night.
Yes, as everyone else did in the wedding party.
Now let's move on to later that night at the hospital. You were there when Genesis ended up becoming very sick, correct?
Yes, I was there when I was told Genesis slipped into a coma.
And you were there when the doctors told you what they believe their diagnosis was?
Pesticide poisoning, yes.
But they did not tell you what led them to that conclusion, did they?
No, they didn't tell me why they came to that conclusion.
They did not tell you of alternative theories?
No, I don't know why they would.
Finally, Mr. Rodriguez, just to be clear, you never saw Harper Martini put pesticides in anything Genesis drank or ate that night, correct?
I never saw Harper do that, no.
You also never saw Harper Martini use pesticides at all, did you?
I'd seen her carrying them, but using them, not necessarily, no.
Thank you. I pass the witness.
Any redirect, Mr. Parak?
So, Your Honor. May this witness please be excused?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Any further witnesses from the plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Danny Francazio.
Okay, Mr. Francazio, you may proceed.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Would you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Danny Francazio.
Mr. Francazio, what do you do for a living?
I run Rosie and Pedro's winery. It's the premier winery in the valley.
How did you get into the wine industry?
I lived on a vineyard growing up. My whole family's in the business. But I was pretty good at football and got drafted to play for the Dallas Cowboys. Got myself a couple of rings, and then I tore my ACL during training and I had to retire. So I joined the family business and I realized the game I was always meant to play was winemaking.
Mr. Francazio, do you know the defendant, Harper Martini?
I'm familiar with Harper. She used to work for me before she opened up her own winery, Peony Estates.
What did she do when she worked at your winery?
I hired Harper back in 2012 as a cellar hand. So she helped with the fermentation process and keeping the cellar clean.
Did the defendant ever have to work directly with pesticides?
Yes, she did. Midlands has a real bug problem, so we sprayed the wine cellar pretty regularly. Harper's job was to make sure that the wine was safe and covered when we used pesticides.
So was the defendant trained in the dangers of pesticide usage?
Of course, everyone needs to know the game plan. I mean, employees weren't even allowed into the wine cellar until they had been trained in pesticide safety. I was also careful to let my employees know how dangerous pesticide could be if it's ingested.
Now, Mr. Francazio, did you know Genesis Petrillo?
Yes, he was a regular at the winery, even a close friend of mine. I still can't believe he's gone.
Can you tell us anything about the defendant and Mr. Petrillo's interactions?
I don't even know where to start with those two. I mean, Harper left me multiple voicemails complaining about Genesis, and not to mention the time they went at it in my winery.
What do you mean they went at it in your winery?
Harper was screaming at Genesis. I mean, they were at each other's throats.
Character evidence, if I may be heard.
Yes, you may.
If I may proffer, Your Honor, the incident that Mr. Francazio is referring to occurred in 2015, several years before the actions that are relevant to today's case. I believe the only reason opposing counsel would elicit this testimony is to make a propensity argument that because Harper was screaming at Genesis, hated Genesis back in 2015, that she would act in accordance with that trait several years later. As such, it's improper character evidence.
What's
Your
your
Honor,
response?
yes, Your Honor. As opposing counsel stated, character evidence must be action and conformity therewith. We're not offering this evidence to show that because Miss Martini screamed at Genesis Petrillo on one occasion, that she screamed at him on another occasion. We're offering this to show the relationship between the two as time went on and how animosity escalated between them. It's not character evidence.
All right, your objection's overruled. Continue.
Now, Mr. Francasio, what do you mean when you said that the defendant and Genesis Petrillo went at it at your winery?
Like I said, Harper was screaming at Genesis. I mean, they were at each other's throats.
What was the defendant screaming about?
She had a lot to say, but I definitely remember her threatening Genesis. She said, if you ever try to take my Casey away from me, it'll be the last thing you ever do.
Now, you also mentioned that Miss Martini sent you multiple voicemails regarding Genesis Petrillo. Would you recognize transcripts of those voicemails if I were to show them to you?
Yeah, I think I would.
Your Honor, permission to screen share Exhibit 18.
Yes, you may.
Mr. Francasio, what's on the screen?
These look like transcripts of those voicemails that Harper sent me.
And are these transcripts true and accurate to what you remember hearing?
Yes, they are.
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff offers Exhibit 18.
Any objections to 18?
Yes, Your Honor, the defense would object to misleading the jury, if I may be heard.
Sure.
Your Honor, these voicemails were left by Harper Martini, but as you can see, Mr. Francasio never picked up the phone. He never spoke with Harper Martini about these statements. Devoid of their context, I believe that they would only go to mislead the jury and inflame their passions against Ms. Martini, but they're not in their full context.
And what's the rule of evidence that you're objecting under then?
I believe it's 403, Your Honor.
Okay, what's your response to the 403 objection, counsel?
Your Honor, under 403, in order for evidence to be thrown out under it, it must be the probative value must be substantially outweighed by any prejudice. Your Honor, Harper Martini, of her own volition, left these statements to Danny Francasio. That does not mean that they're devoid of any context. And furthermore, I do believe the defense is calling Miss Martini to the stand today, and they're free to ask her what she meant and what context she sent these transcripts in, but that is not sufficiently prejudicial enough to outweigh the probative value.
What's the probative value of these messages?
Your Honor, throughout these messages, Harper Martini will state her relationship with Genesis Petrillo as time went on, from 6 months before the wedding all the way up to just a few weeks before the wedding. And multiple times throughout, she mentions that she doesn't want Genesis Petrillo in her life anymore and doesn't think that both of them will survive the wedding. That is highly probative and substantially outweighs any prejudice.
May I respond to that, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
In that case, I would amend my objection again to character evidence. That at this point, I believe it's clear opposing counsel is using statements of the defendant made months, weeks before the wedding to establish a character trait that they are trying to prove she acted in conformity with.
Okay, let's stay with 403 for just a second, because I'm going to overrule your 403 objection. I think you can explore those issues on cross-examination. Counsel, what's your response to the character evidence objection now?
Your Honor, again, we're not offering this for propensity, that because she said something on one occasion that she would say something on another occasion. This is going towards her relationship with Genesis Petrillo and her intentions.
Okay, last word, defense.
Your Honor, in that case, if the plaintiff is not using this for a propensity argument, I fail to see how it is relevant. What Harper Martini said months before the day in question. So I believe they are using it to make a propensity argument. that's the only way it's relevant.
Okay, I'm going to overrule the objection and admit 18B.
Your Honor, just to clarify, this was regarding the entirety of 18. It's A through E. We just separated them based on the occasion.
Okay, then 18 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Francasio, directing your attention to this exhibit 18B, when did you receive this, or are you aware of when Genesis Petrio's wedding was?
Yeah, I actually received an invitation, so I know it was on June 8th of 2019.
And how long did you receive this voicemail before the wedding?
About 6 months before the wedding.
Did the defendant mention Mr. Petrio in this voicemail?
Yes. She was talking about the election and then said, someone needs to shut Genesis down. I'd vote for that person no matter what.
Directing your attention to exhibit 18D, how long before the wedding did you receive this voicemail?
About 5 months before the wedding.
Did the defendant mention Mr. Petrio in this voicemail?
Yes, she did.
What did she say?
She said, Genesis is like a cellar pest, good for nothing, just making things bad wherever they go. They need to make a Genesis pesticide. I'd buy that.
Now, finally, directing your attention to exhibit 18, or excuse me, did the defendant say anything else about Mr. Petrio in this voicemail?
Yes. She also said, I swear, only one of us will survive this wedding.
Finally, directing your attention to exhibit 18E, did the defendant mention Mr. Petrio in this voicemail?
Yes, right there. Miserable, selfish Genesis. I've had enough. I'm beyond my breaking point. It's going to be me or Genesis, not the both of us.
When the defendant said it's going to be me or Genesis, not the both of us, how long was it before Mr. Petrio's wedding?
Just a couple weeks.
Thank you, Mr. Francasio. Your Honor, I pass the witness, and at this time, we'll take down this screen share.
Cross, Ms. Averett?
Yes, may I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes.
Good morning, Mr. Francasio. I want to talk some about those voicemails you mentioned on direct. Now, Harper called you several times, right?
Yes, that's right.
You never answered the phone?
No, I was always in the wrong place at the wrong time.
She called you, you never answered the phone, so you don't know what she meant by what she said in those voicemails, right?
Well, I just know what she said. If you're asking me to try and speculate as to what she said, I'm sorry, I can't.
I'm not asking you to speculate, I'm just asking what you know, Mr. Francasio, and the truth is you don't know what she meant.
No, I just know what she said.
You don't know the context of those statements?
No, again, I just know what she said.
You don't know if she was joking or being serious?
No, ma'am, I don't.
But you clearly didn't take them too seriously at the time.
I wouldn't say that.
You'd say you did take them seriously?
I took everything seriously that Harper sent me, yes.
Mr. Francasio, you never contacted the authorities after listening to these voicemails?
No, but after Harper sent me some emails, I did contact an investigator to make sure that everything at Peony Estates was up to safety codes.
Mr. Francasio, I'm asking about the voicemails. After
Okay.
hearing what Harper had to say, you say you took it seriously, but you never contacted any authorities, correct?
No, I didn't find it necessary. I was in contact with Harper through our emails.
Mr. Francasio, in those emails, you did not discuss Harper's relationship with Genesis.
No, I didn't.
Mr. Francasio, you didn't try to warn Genesis about what you'd heard in those voicemails?
No, I believe Genesis could handle himself.
Okay. Now I want to talk about an incident you spoke about on direct. You talked about when you saw Harper and Genesis interact in the winery. This was in 2015.
Yes, I know what you're talking about.
This was the last time you actually saw Harper Martini in person, right?
Yes, that is right.
This is the only time you've seen Harper and Genesis interact?
Yes, in person, that's right.
The only time you've seen them interact at all.
Yes, again, in person.
4 years prior to the wedding?
Yes, it was.
And you haven't spoken with Harper Martini in person or on the phone since that time?
No, again, we've been communicating through emails though.
Mr. Francasio, you can't actually say what Harper and Genesis' relationship was like.
I can only tell you what Harper's told me through those voicemails.
And you never spoke with Genesis about the relationship either?
No, I do know Genesis had reached out to me on how to anonymously report a health code violation.
You never spoke with Genesis about her relationship with Harper, about his relationship with Harper, excuse me?
No.
Okay, so you can't actually tell me anything about what the relationship was like.
No, ma'am. Again, I can only tell you what Harper sent me in those voicemails.
The voicemails for which you have no context?
The voicemails that I just read off, yes.
And you never called her back?
No, I did not.
All right, now I want to move on and talk about when Harper used to work for you. She left in 2015 to start her own winery.
Yes, that's right. Peony Estates.
And this felt like a betrayal.
Yes, I did feel betrayed. Harper and his family.
She took a huge chunk of your business away from you, didn't she, Mr. Francasio?
No, she took some of my senior staff with her, but not a huge chunk of my business.
Your testimony that she did not take a huge chunk of your business away when she started Peony Estates?
She did not take a huge chunk of my business, no.
Mr. Francasio, you had to take a 25% pay cut when Harper started Peony Estates.
Yes, that's right.
From laying people off.
I'm sorry, you cut out.
Just to keep from laying people off, Mr. Francasio, you had to take a 25% pay cut when Harper opened Peony Estates.
Oh, yes, in early 2016 I did, to make sure all of my employees could put food on the table for their family. I always put my employees first.
That's a yes to my question. That was because Harper Martini opened up her own winery?
No, that was because we started to lose business.
Because Harper Martini opened up her own winery. Right, Ms. Francasio?
I think so. I can't be sure, though.
Mr. Francasio, you recall writing an affidavit for today's case, correct?
Yes, that's right.
You were told to include all relevant information in that affidavit.
Yes, ma'am.
You were aware you had up until moments before today's trial began to add any relevant information, correct?
Yes.
And this is your signature down at the bottom?
Yes, that is.
All right. Now, if you could direct your attention to lines there you go. If you can see on the screen, would you read along with me silently, Mr. Francasio, as I read aloud from lines 126 onward? The opening of Peony Estates in 2015 severely harmed my business. It didn't help that Peony Estates doubled as a bed and breakfast while Rosie and Pedro's did not. By early 2016, wine orders were down. Visitor numbers were down. Staff morale of those who stuck around was down. In fact, I had to take a 25% pay cut just to ensure we didn't have to lay anyone off. I primarily blame Harper and Peony Estates for my business woes.
Yes, as I said, Harper took half of my senior staff. That is part of my business woes. And as far as Harper hurting my business, you asked if she took a huge chunk of my business. I never say that in this affidavit now.
Mr. Francasio, so you would agree with me that you had to take a 25% pay cut because Harper Martini opened up Peony Estates. That's what you said in your affidavit.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. May I be heard?
Yes, you may.
Your Honor, I understand that opposing counsel is using this out-of-court statement for impeachment purposes. However, no direct contradiction to what Mr. Francasio said has been shown. He admitted he took a 25% pay cut, but opposing counsel specifically asked him that the 25% pay cut was because Harper Martini took a huge chunk of his business. No contradicting statement to that has been shown, and thus this is hearsay.
Okay, what's your response?
Your Honor, I asked the witness if he had to take that pay cut and if he lost that business because Harper Martini opened Peony Estates and he disagreed with me. I was just merely using this to impeach him because, as you can see, after Peony Estates opened up 2016, he had to take the pay cut. He had to ensure he didn't lay people off. He says, I blame Harper and Peony Estates for my business woes. I believe that there was a contradiction.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes.
Opposing counsel's specific question was whether Harper took a big chunk of business away from him. That is the only statement that Mr. Francasio did not agree to, and there is no contradicting statement. He admitted he took a 25% pay cut. He admitted he didn't want to lay anyone off, and that's why he took it. He even admitted that Harper Martini was to blame for his business woes, but not because they took away his business, but because they took away his staff when she first opened up the winery. Your Honor, those are two different things. And for opposing counsel is misconstruing that Mr. Francasio felt that she took away her business.
Okay, this is what we're going to do. Let's take down the deposition. If you need to impeach on a specific inconsistency, we can do that. I don't see that at this time, so continue with your cross-examination.
Your Honor, motion to strike the portion where the affidavit was written and read into the court's report.
It's so stricken, the jury is instructed to disregard any statements read out of the affidavit.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Francasio, you blame Harper Martini for your business woes, correct?
Yes, she did take half of my senior staff.
She took half of your staff and this felt like a betrayal?
Yes.
Mr. Francasio, Mr. Francasio, you blame Harper Martini for your business woes, and it is a direct result of her opening Peony Estates that you lost business, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered and compound question.
Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Francasio, it would be good for your business if Peony Estates went under, correct?
Probably, I don't know.
And as of 2018, they still outranked Rosie and Pedro's?
Yes, they did, but we were number 2.
All right, pass the witness.
Anything further from Mr. Francasio?
No, Your Honor. May he step down from the witness stand?
You may. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Are there any further witnesses for the plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Dr. Kwan to the stand.
Okay, Dr. Kwan. You may proceed.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hello, my name is Dr. Jimin Kwan.
Dr. Kwan, how are you involved in this case?
I was the chief emergency physician at River Valley Hospital when Genesis Petrillo arrived nauseous and vomiting. Despite our best efforts, Mr. Petrillo didn't make it. It was my job to come to a conclusion about his cause of death.
Let's take a step back. What trainings and qualifications do you have in the field of emergency medicine and toxicology?
Well, I received my medical degree from UNC Chapel Hill and completed my residency at Emory University. Since then, I've been working in the ER, and I even published a few articles on the subject.
Turning your attention back to this case, how did you treat Mr. Petrillo when he came to your hospital?
I use the standard procedures of emergency medicine. We start by examining the patient, which includes noting all of their symptoms. We then run tests like blood tests or toxicology panels before diagnosing and treating the patient.
And were these procedures sufficient to come to a conclusion about the manner of Mr. Petrillo's death?
Yes, after examining, diagnosing, and treating Mr. Petrillo, I concluded that he died as a result of pesticide poisoning.
Objection, Your Honor.
Objection.
Yes, Your Honor. I object to improper expert opinion. May I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, per Davis v. Adams, the court's responsibility with regards to expert testimony is to establish the reliability of their methods. And Your Honor, Tarot Readers Association of Midlands v. Merrill Dow establishes that that reliability is determined by the widespread use of a method, as well as peer review, known error rate, and the accuracy of that method. Your Honor, I don't believe that any of those things has been established. So while it's been established that Dr. Kwan used a method, there's been no foundation laid to prove the reliability of that method. And I ask that opposing counsel lay that foundation before the expert goes into his opinion.
Let me ask you this before we have a response. Are you contending that they will not be able to lay that foundation, or they just have not done so yet?
Your Honor, I believe as opposing counsel has, as Dr. Kwan has established that this was an emergency medicine process, I don't believe that they will be able to lay the sufficient foundation to establish reliable results from this analysis due to the intense and time-restricted manner and time constraint during which the analysis was conducted.
Okay, let's hear your response, Ms. Bukai.
Yes, Your Honor, I believe this foundation has been laid. Pursuant to Tarot Readers Association of Midlands v. Merrill Dow, the only important piece of information is that the error must be standard. Information such as the error rate and accuracy is helpful but not dispositive. Your Honor, the witness has stated that their method, examine, test, and diagnose, is standard and therefore has fulfilled the prong of 702C.
Okay. Mr. Scheidler, do you want to take Dr. Kwan on voir dire to explore this issue? I guess where I'm at, I'm not seeing that we've gotten far enough in the examination to determine whether or not we've got a reliable methodology.
Your Honor, due to time constraints, I'd rather not voir dire. I would simply contend that while opposing counsel has established that this is the standard method for treating a patient who has come into the emergency room, it has not been established that this is the standard method for diagnosing a patient's ailments post-mortem, or that Dr. Kwan did any analysis post-mortem to establish Genesis Petrio's cause of death. As far as we know, all he did was examine her when she came into the hospital before she passed away.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to overrule your objection for now. If you feel like it's warranted later on in the testimony, you may re-urge it, and you may also explore these issues on cross-examination. You can continue, Ms. Bukai.
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Kwan, let's start with the first step of your procedure, examine. How did you examine Mr. Petrio?
When Mr. Petrio arrived in the emergency room, he was already in pretty bad shape. We immediately started examining him by noting all of his symptoms and taking his vitals. At first, it seemed that he was suffering from alcohol poisoning.
Your Honor, may Dr. Kwan share his screen for the purposes of a demonstrative?
Yes.
Opposing counsel has already seen this. Thank you. Dr. Kwan, what's on the screen?
This is a chart I made comparing Mr. Petrio's symptoms to two possible diagnoses, either alcohol poisoning or pesticide poisoning.
What symptoms did Mr. Petrio exhibit?
The early symptoms included nausea and vomiting, stomach cramps, difficulty walking, and slowed breathing. As the symptoms progressed, we also saw chest tightness and trouble breathing, contracted pupils and excessive tearing, involuntary muscle twitching and incontinence, followed by slowed pulse, and finally seizures.
And which symptoms aligned with your initial diagnosis of alcohol poisoning?
The early symptoms, including nausea and vomiting, stomach cramps, difficulty walking, and slowed breathing. But as you can see, none of the more severe symptoms align with a diagnosis of alcohol poisoning. For example, Mr. Petrio had contracted pupils. In the case of alcohol poisoning, you'd actually expect the opposite, for the pupils to dilate.
Did you suspect any other causes of Mr. Petrio's symptoms?
Yes. After years of working in the ER, it seemed evident that Mr. Petrio was suffering from pesticide poisoning.
What symptoms were consistent with your suspicions?
All of them. From the early symptoms to the most severe, all of Mr. Petrio's symptoms aligned with a diagnosis of pesticide poisoning.
Thank you for sharing your screen, Dr. Kwan. After you suspected that Mr. Petrio had been poisoned by pesticide, what did you do?
I immediately administered the antidote for pesticide poisoning. Mr. Petrio's symptoms were so severe that we were about to lose him.
Did the antidote work?
Unfortunately, no. Mr. Petrillo fell into a coma before passing away at 9:27 on the morning of June 8th.
You mentioned the second step of your procedure, testing. Could you explain how you applied this process?
Of course. Shortly after Mr. Petrillo's death, I received the results of two tests I had ordered, the poisons analysis and the toxicology report.
Let's start with the poisons analysis. What did those results tell you?
Analysis of Mr. Petrillo's stomach contents showed the presence of wine. By isolating the food particles, we found that they did not contain pesticide. Only the wine did.
Moving to the toxicology report, what did those results tell you?
These test results showed that Mr. Petrillo had a BAC, blood alcohol content, of 0.16%.
How is the BAC level relevant to your conclusion?
Well, the BAC confirmed what we had already suspected. Mr. Petrillo was intoxicated because he had been drinking. However, the relatively low level of alcohol in his system would not have caused the severity of symptoms we saw.
Did the toxicology report contain any other important information?
Yes, the test also showed us Mr. Petrillo's enzyme levels, specifically for an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase.
What did Mr. Petrillo's enzyme levels tell you?
Well, the enzyme levels were low. Just like smoke is a sign of fire, low enzyme levels are a sign of pesticide's effect on the body.
Let's move to the final step of your process, diagnose. Based on your observations and the test results, what do you believe is Mr. Petrillo's cause of death?
I can say to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that Mr. Petrillo
I'm
died as a
sorry,
result
Your
of...
Honor, at this time I re-raise my objection to improper expert opinion.
Okay, as to which particular opinion that the doctor offered, are you objecting?
Your Honor, I object to the cause of death opinion that he is offering. Your Honor, while it's been established that he examined Genesis Petrillo while alive, it has not been established that he's conducted significant or sufficient reliable tests to determine her cause of death after she passed away, or after he passed away, excuse me.
Okay,
May I
what's your
respond,
response?
Your Honor? Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Kwan has stated that he examined, tested, and diagnosed Mr. Petrillo. That includes a poisons analysis and a toxicology report. Therefore, the standard for 702C has been relayed.
Last word, Mr. Scheidler.
Yes, Your Honor, I stand by my objection that opposing counsel and Dr. Kwan have not entered sufficient evidence to show that Dr. Kwan applied reliable methods to determining cause of death. They have only established that he used standards methods in conducting emergency room medical treatment. And Your Honor, I don't believe that's sufficient to correspond to cause of death diagnosis.
All right, your objection is well taken. I'll overrule it. Allow the testimony.
Dr. Kwan, what was your final conclusion in today's case?
Mr. Petrillo died as a result of pesticide poisoning. The most likely source of the pesticide was the wine he drank on the night of June 7th.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions at this time.
All right, cross-examination.
Good morning, Dr. Kwan. I want to start, because we're a little short on time, by talking about the pesticide test that you conducted.
Sure.
Now, you tested specifically for organophosphate pesticide poisoning, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
Dr. Kwan, it's actually impossible to detect organophosphate in a person's bloodstream.
Yes, that's true.
The pesticide undergoes rapid hydrolysis in the liver.
Yes, that's correct. We tested for the presence of pesticide in Mr. Petrillo's stomach contents.
However, it's impossible to actually detect organophosphates in the bloodstream, yes?
Yes, that's true.
Instead, you look for acetylcholinesterase, or rather low acetylcholinesterase.
That's right. It's a conclusive indicator for pesticide poisoning.
Dr. Kwan, low acetylcholinesterase can also indicate liver failure, yes?
Yes, that's possible, although it is very rare.
Now, Dr. Kwan, I want to briefly talk about that demonstrative you brought up. You showed that Genesis Petrillo was demonstrating several symptoms of alcohol poisoning.
I believe it was only about 3 or 4 symptoms. That's correct.
And it's possible to be suffering from alcohol poisoning and other ailments, isn't it, Dr. Kwan?
Yes, that's true.
So the fact that Genesis Petrillo had other symptoms doesn't rule out alcohol poisoning as a possible diagnosis, does it?
No, that's not correct.
Well, Dr. Kwan, it's possible that she was suffering from other ailments and suffering alcohol poisoning, yes?
While that's possible, there were clear symptoms that Mr. Petrillo exhibited that directly contradict a diagnosis of alcohol poisoning.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. Now, I want to move on to your examination of Genesis Petrillo. This examination was conducted in an emergency room.
Yes, that's where I work.
And this is a context in which time is of the essence. Yes, Dr. Kwan?
Sorry, I don't quite understand your question. Could you repeat it?
Time is of the essence in an emergency room, yes?
Yes, when a patient's life is on the line, we have to work quickly.
In fact, you only had Genesis Petrillo for a few hours before he passed away.
Yes, that's correct.
So you were operating in a high pressure environment.
Yes, I suppose so.
And you were operating with limited time.
True.
Now, Dr. Kwan, I want to finish by talking about some tests that you didn't run. You never ran a liver function test.
No, it wasn't necessary.
You never examined Genesis Petrillo's medical records for any evidence of an allergic reaction.
No, the medical records didn't indicate such.
And Dr. Kwan, let's talk briefly about those symptoms of organophosphate pesticide poisoning that you identified. Dr. Kwan, you identified pupil contraction?
Yes, that was one of Mr. Petrillo's symptoms.
You identified muscle twitching?
Yes.
And Dr. Kwan, you identified these are also symptoms of liver failure, yes?
Yes, you can see them with liver failure, but given Mr. Petrillo's other symptoms, this did not seem possible.
Dr. Kwan, you're on the board of Doctors for Organic Solutions?
Yes, I am.
A group that advocates for the abolition of chemical pesticides?
Yes, I think this case shows us how dangerous pesticides actually are. They pose a needless risk to the public's health.
And you hope that the death of your patient leads to the change that you've advocated for?
No, I wouldn't say that at all, no.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Any further questions for Dr. Kwan?
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Kwan, you examined Mr. Petrillo on the night of his death, correct? That's true?
Yes, that is correct.
And how did you go about making your conclusion for today's case?
Well, as I mentioned before, I first examined Mr. Petrillo and then ran testing on several different samples, including a blood test, analysis of his stomach contents, as well as we received an enzyme test. All of this testing allowed me to conclude that pesticide poisoning was the most likely cause of death.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions. The plaintiff rests their case at this time.
All right. Is there anything that we need to take up before we launch into the defense case in chief?
Your Honor, may we take a brief 5-minute recess?
Yes. So it is 11:24 Central Time. Let's be back at 11:29.
Yes, Your Honor.
And when we come back, if everybody could, and it's participating, open up their cameras, including the scoring judges, so that I know that y'all are here. Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, does it look like we have everybody back? Thank you, scoring judges. Y'all can close your cameras. Plaintiff, are you ready to proceed with the defense case in chief?
Yes, Your Honor, the plaintiff is ready to proceed.
Defense, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor, the defense is ready to proceed at this time.
Excellent. You may call your first witness.
Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Rose Cannon to the stand.
Dr. Cannon, you may proceed.
Good morning. Please introduce yourself to the court.
My name is Dr. Rose Cannon, and I'm a medical doctor with both expertise in toxicology and pharmacology.
Where did you pursue your education?
So I received my BS in chemistry at The Ohio State University. I then went on to pursue my medical degree with an emphasis in toxicology at Harvard Medical School.
And what do you do for a living now?
I used to be the chief toxicologist at Massachusetts General Hospital. However, I am now an associate consultant for Gartner Consulting and Corporate.
Dr. Cannon, how did you become involved with today's case?
I was hired by Harper Martini's attorneys to assess the findings of Dr. Jim and Kwan.
Before we get into those findings, how did you go about conducting your assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I used a method common in my field, and we're actually taught this method in medical school when reviewing another doctor's work, and the method is called the EARS method. So first, I gather all of my evidence, and from there, I then assess what has been presented to me, and then I conduct my own research, and then based on my research, I select the most plausible of my findings to include in my report.
Is that the standard method in your field?
Yes, absolutely. We're taught this in medical school when reviewing another doctor's work.
And it's widely used?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Cannon, can you talk about the evidence that you reviewed in preparing for today's case?
Absolutely. I reviewed the 2 toxicology reports from the hospital, as well as Genesis Petrio's official death certificate. I also reviewed Dr. Kwan's official reports and Angel Rodriguez's affidavit.
Did you find these to be reliable sources of data?
Yes.
Now, what did Dr. Kwan find in his cause of death report?
Dr. Kwan found that the patient consumed organophosphate pesticide from the wine produced by Harper Martini that then led to Genesis Petrio's death.
Before we move on, can you explain what organophosphate pesticide is?
It's a pesticide that's used to kill insects, and it can be deadly to humans in certain quantities, but we don't actually know the fatal dose.
Do you agree with Dr. Kwan's conclusions?
Dr. Kwan had a narrow analysis of the patient, so they came to a narrow conclusion. I, on the other hand, cannot rule out 3 main possible alternatives when determining cause of death.
What's that first alternative cause of death?
Given Petrio's symptoms, there are so many unknowns in the situation. I, however, cannot rule out that Petrio suffered from hepatic disease, which is also known as chronic liver disease.
What is hepatic disease?
Well, hepatic disease can lead the liver in failing to break down the alcohol in the bloodstream. It can also lead to the symptoms like nausea, vomiting, even the low levels of acetylcholine esterase, also known as ACHE, which are all symptoms that the patient presented with. Had I been the on-call physician, I might have run several liver functioning tests just to ensure that Genesis's liver was functioning properly.
And how is liver disease usually diagnosed?
It's typically diagnosed through a series of regular blood tests. However, since Mr. Petrio didn't actually have regular checkups, we can't rule out liver disease with a substantial degree of scientific certainty.
Dr. Cannon, what was the second alternative cause of death that you mentioned?
That the patient suffered from alcohol poisoning, which Dr. Kwan actually noted at first, but turned away from once they suspected the pesticides. And alcohol poisoning can lead to respiratory arrest, which was the patient's ultimate cause of death.
Was Genesis Petrio showing a high blood alcohol content at the time of her death, or his death, excuse me?
Well, from Dr. Kwan's report, it reported that his blood alcohol content, also known as a BAC, was 0.16%. But Dr. Kwan failed to note in their report that a BAC actually doesn't remain constant.
What does that mean for today's case?
So the patient's BAC was likely in decline by the time that they were admitted into the hospital. Essentially, Petrio's BAC was likely much higher than 0.16% that evening. It had just gone down by the time that Dr. Kwan actually ran the test.
And is it plausible that Genesis Petrio's blood alcohol content was at a fatal level at some point that evening?
I think that it's really important to note here that a fatal BAC is different for every individual. So it is plausible that Mr. Petrio had a much higher BAC earlier in the evening, and that could have been fatal for him.
Let's move on to that third alternative cause of death. What was the last alternative that you couldn't rule out?
That the pesticide entered Petrio's system by a different way than the wine produced by Harper Martini. When Dr. Kwan tested the stomach contents of the patient, it revealed that the wine contains the pesticide in question. However, we can't actually know with scientific certainty that the pesticide came from the wine.
Can you elaborate on why that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So the stomach actually produces acids and enzymes and mechanically churns the stomach to begin the digestive process.
Could you maybe explain how that works? I'm not good with medical details personally.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually how I explain it to my students. So let's say that there are three main contents in Petrio's stomach. One is food, one is pesticide, and the other was the wine. Now, once the digestive process actually begins, all of these contents actually begin to mix together because the stomach is churning. So now, because it's all mixed together, you can't actually tell whether the pesticide came from the food, whether the pesticide came from the wine, or whether the pesticide came from a different source that we're just unaware of.
Dr. Cannon, thank you for explaining that. Could we go in briefly to the tests that Dr. Kwan ran? How did Dr. Kwan diagnose organophosphate pesticide poisoning?
So it's actually impossible to determine the presence of the pesticide in question in a person's bloodstream. The test that Dr. Kwan administered only looked for indicators of organophosphate poisoning, such as the low levels of ACHE. But even low levels of ACHE don't conclusively determine the pesticide's presence.
Can low acetylcholinesterase also point to other ailments?
Oh yes, absolutely, such as the liver disease or liver failure, like I mentioned before.
Dr. Cannon, I want to finish by asking you about your report. You say that organophosphate pesticide poisoning is the most likely cause of death. Why are you still here today on the stand?
Yeah, absolutely. So say that there are four possible causes of death, right? And 3 out of the 4 have a 10% chance of occurring, but one of them has an 11% chance of occurring. The 11% one is most likely to have occurred, but not more likely to have occurred than not.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. I pass the witness.
May I proceed with cross-examination?
Cross-examination, yes.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Cannon.
Good morning.
Let's talk about your previous experience. You work for a consulting firm, is that true?
That's correct.
You've been hired to testify for clients before?
Yes, I have been.
You've testified in 35 different cases?
Yes, I have.
And of those 35 different cases, you've only testified for the defense?
Yes.
I want to focus on your analysis in this case. You never personally examined Mr. Petrio's body?
No, I didn't. But as a consultant, that's not typical when applying my method.
You couldn't run any test on him to verify your conclusion?
Objection,
No,
Your Honor.
What's your objection?
Your Honor, I believe under Rule 403, this is misleading the jury. May I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, it's been established on direct examination that Dr. Cannon relied on reliable sources of data. In fact, the same data that Dr. Kwan relied upon. To insinuate that her testimony is less reliable because she didn't conduct her own tests is misleading to the jury because it's already been established that her data was reliable.
I'm going to overrule your objection. Carry.
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Cannon, you only reviewed documents as a part of your analysis. Is that true?
Yes. But like I said, that's typical in my line of work.
Right. That included a 5-page report?
Yes.
A 6-page affidavit?
Yes. And then I also looked over the toxicology reports and the official death certificate.
That amounts to about 16 pages of documents in total?
Yes.
So you used about 16 pages of information to come to your conclusion for this trial?
I would also like to add that I am a toxicologist and I've been doing this for many years, so I know what it's like to assess findings of another doctor.
So that's a yes to my question.
Yes.
And for that conclusion, you are being paid $50,000. Do I have that right?
I charge a flat fee for all of my consulting services, but I didn't charge to testify here in court today.
Let's move to your alternative theories of death. You also consider alcohol poisoning as a possibility.
Yes.
Mr. Petrillo had a recorded BAC of 0.16%. Is that true?
Yes, but like I said in my direct, it was likely much higher earlier in the evening, but we just don't know, especially without an account of every single drink that Mr. Petrillo consumed.
That's true. It's impossible to determine the peak BAC level.
Yes, but we also cannot say that the 0.16% was at any way their actual BAC earlier in the evening as well.
And BAC needs to be above 0.3% for it to be fatal. Is that true?
And not in every single case, but typically, yes. But again, we don't actually know whether it hit that 30%, that 0.30, or whether it didn't.
But that's a yes. In your experience, BAC needs to be 0.3% for it to be fatal?
Typically in my experience, but like I said in my direct, a fatal BAC can be different for every individual.
You also discussed liver disease as a possible alternative, right?
Yes, given Petrillo's symptoms, especially the low levels of ACHE.
Liver disease is commonly associated with jaundice, right?
Yes, but it is important to note that not every single patient does experience the yellowing of the skin.
So Mr. Petrillo had no jaundice?
Dr. Kwan did not include that in their report.
In fact, you believe that liver disease is the least likely cause of Mr. Petrillo's death.
Like I said, all of the symptoms are lining up pretty well with hepatic disease, as well as we can't actually rule out liver disease because we don't have record of Petrillo's past blood tests.
But that's a yes. You believe it's the least likely conclusion?
Out of all the possibilities that I've presented, it is the least likely.
Dr. Cannon, you also believe that something other than the bottle of wine could have poisoned Mr. Petrillo.
Again, we just can't know with a substantial degree of scientific certainty where the pesticide came from.
You're aware that no other guests at the rehearsal dinner got sick that night?
That's what the report explained.
No other guests were admitted to the hospital for poisoning?
Not that I'm aware of.
And all the food and drinks from that dinner were tested?
As far as I know.
There was no organophosphate pesticide in any of them?
As far as I know.
So as far as you know, nothing other than the Cara wine that Mr. Petrillo drank that night tested positive for pesticide?
That's what the report concluded. But again, we cannot know with a substantial degree of scientific certainty that the pesticide came from the wine. No test exists to actually conclusively determine that.
Dr. Cannon, your conclusion was that pesticide is the most likely cause of death, true?
Like I said in my direct, most likely in no way means more likely, and most likely certainly does not mean scientific certainty in any way.
So that's a yes. You believe that pesticide is the most likely cause of death?
Yes, but again, that does not mean that I'm saying that with scientific certainty in any way.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. Your Honor, before I pass the witness, I would like to read stipulation 9 onto the record.
Okay.
All leftover food and beverages, alcoholic and otherwise, from the June 7, 2019 rehearsal dinner were tested, and those tests found no organophosphate pesticide or any other abnormalities. I now pass the witness, Your Honor.
Any further questions for Dr. Cannon?
No further questions, Your Honor. I just ask that the witness be allowed to step down.
You may. Thank you, Doctor. Are there any further witnesses from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Casey Soto to the stand.
Okay, Mr. Soto, you may proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Soto.
Good morning.
Could you please introduce yourself to the court?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Casey Soto.
What do you do for a living, Mr. Soto?
Right now, not much. I'm just focused on getting through each day.
I understand this is going to be completely difficult for you, Mr. Soto, so if at any point you need a break, please just let me know.
Thank you.
Now, moving on to you and Genesis' relationship, when did you and Mr. Petrillo meet?
We first met in 2012. It's funny, you don't expect to meet the love of your life at a party that was thrown by your ex, but there Jen and I were.
What do you remember most about Jen?
Look, I know that this is going to sound just so Hollywood, but I remember noticing the lilt in his voice when he smiled, and it felt like I'd never lived a moment in my life before Jen had come into it, and I knew then.
What did you know?
That we had to be together. We exchanged numbers and we're dating by the end of the month. We were inseparable.
Now, let's move on to your mother, Harper Martini, and Genesis' relationship. When did they first meet?
Well, Harper, my mom, she could be a lot to be around. So it took me a while to muster up the courage to bring Jen around. And it wasn't until 2015, just after my mother had opened Peony Estates.
And how did that first meeting go?
Honestly, not great. I failed to mention to Jen that my mother actually owned Peony Estates, and my mother brought him some wine, and he asked if there was anything classier. It was a big misunderstanding.
Now, did this first meeting leave a lasting impression on your mother?
Yes and no. She seemed reluctant to forgive Jen for the snarky comment about the wine, but when I confronted my mom about it, she seemed willing to put the whole ordeal behind them for my happiness.
Now, moving back in time, when did you and Genesis first get engaged?
It was the best day of my life. It was July 18th, 2018. Jen, he proposed to me. He beat me to it by a day, but I didn't even care. We were just so in love, and that's all that really matters, right?
Now, did the wedding planning affect Harper and Genesis's relationship at all?
Kind of yes and no. There were some disagreements, but we got most of them hashed out before the wedding.
So was it smoothed over before the wedding?
Yeah, there was one ordeal where it was my fault. I had decided to have the wedding at a competitor of Peony Estates, Rosie and Pedro's, and when my mother found out, she was upset, but eventually we got it all straightened out, and she gave us a discount to have the wedding at Peony Estates.
Did the wedding planning put any further strain on the relationship?
Again, I don't think so. There was just some disagreements, but we got them all hashed out.
So is this the end of the pre-wedding drama?
You must never have planned a wedding before. No, it was not. About a month or so before the wedding, my mother, she'd gotten some sort of bad test and told me that Peony needed the good publicity from a wedding to help keep everything in line.
So would you say that the relationship was mended?
I was trying to mend the relationship, and I think that I was finally making some headway too. My mother said that she wanted the wedding to be perfect no matter who I was marrying, for the publicity and for me.
And did your mother keep that promise?
I think she was trying. Long-standing grudges, they don't just go away overnight, but they seemed less hateful towards one another. There were some snarky comments in passing leading up during the wedding, but frankly, I'd call it an improvement.
Now let's move on to the day of the rehearsal dinner. How were Genesis and Harper's interactions on that day?
Well, towards the end of the night, my mother, she presented Jen with a bottle of wine, and I have to tell you, I breathed for the first time in so long because it felt like the people that I loved most were finally turning a corner in their relationship.
What else did you witness that night?
Not much. I went to bed pretty shortly thereafter that, and I kissed Jen goodnight and I went to bed. I wish I knew then that it was gonna be the last time I ever saw him, or I would have never let him go.
Now, Mr. Soto, I want to move on to the morning of June 8th, 2019. What happened that morning?
I got up early to get ready for the wedding, and then a little after 8:30, Angel, he came into my room, and I don't even remember what he said. I remember hearing Genesis and hearing coma, and we were on the way to the hospital.
Objection, Your Honor. Under Rule 403, we understand that this is difficult for the witness, but we ask that this be stricken. It's more unduly prejudicial than it is probative.
What's your response, Ms. Trigg?
Your Honor, the probative value of this statement is simply going to what he did next, going to the hospital, which is where unfortunately his husband or fiance did find his demise, the prejudicial value of his emotion does not outrule the relevance of this statement, and as well, the bar for relevance is incredibly low.
Your Honor, if I may respond.
Overruled. Proceed.
Mr. Soto, what happened when you got to the hospital?
We were too late. Jen, he had died 5 minutes before we got there. He was my whole world, and it just came crumbling down. We were too late.
Now, Mr. Soto, to your knowledge, is there anybody that may have wanted Genesis dead?
I don't know. Maybe one of my exes. I don't.
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. May I be heard?
Sure. Yeah.
Your Honor, Mr. Soto's testimony about whether, or opinion on whether or not someone had an opportunity or a motive to do so is not directly relevant to this case. It does not prove any fact to be more consequential, not relevant.
Your response, Ms. Trade.
Your Honor, intent is incredibly relative in this case, as it is one of the prongs of the charge of battery.
Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Soto, how were your mother and Genesis's relations the day of the rehearsal dinner?
I told you I thought they were better. I said I thought I got the feeling that they were willing to put the ordeal behind them for my happiness.
And Mr. Soto, do you believe that your mother could have poisoned wine to kill Genesis?
My mom, she told me she wanted the wedding to be perfect and to go off without a hitch for publicity and for my happiness. I don't know why she would have done this.
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. Motion to strike.
Your Honor, if I may.
What's your response?
Mr. Soto has just relayed a message that his mother told him, I apologize, saying that she wanted the wedding to go off without a hitch for publicity. This directly goes to why she would not poison the wedding and kill Genesis. Therefore, it is incredibly relevant.
I think the objection is speculation.
I'm so sorry. Your Honor, he is not speculating, as he is basing his opinion off of a statement that he heard directly from his mother.
All right. Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Soto, why did your mother want this wedding to go well?
She said she wanted the publicity. I just can't imagine she would have done anything to jeopardize it. She was a business first kind of woman.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay.
What's the statement you're objecting to?
I'm objecting to his mother, the party representative statements in this matter.
Which particular statement are you objecting to him testifying to?
What he used in the testimony, I believe, was something along the lines of what his mother said in this matter. That's hearsay. It's an out-of-court statement, and it's not protected by any exemptions.
Okay, what's your response, Ms. Trigg?
First off, Your Honor, these statements are already on the record. 2 questions prior, he has already stated these. Beyond that, under 8033, this is a then existing mental, emotional, or physical condition, which goes to the state of mind, which in 8033 says a motive, intent, or plan, which is exactly what this is going to.
Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Soto, I'm so sorry, I don't believe you were able to finish. Why did your mother want this to go well?
She wanted the good publicity.
Thank you. I pass the witness.
Cross-examination, Mr. Brock.
Yes, Your Honor. Okay. Good morning, Mr. Soto.
Good morning.
I want to start by saying that I'm incredibly sorry for your loss and sorry that you have to live through this again, but I appreciate you being here. I'd like to ask you some questions, if that's okay.
It is, yeah.
I want to start with your relationship with the defendant. You were the defendant's only family, right?
Yeah, it was just me and my mom.
The defendant really cared about you.
I hope so. Yeah, I think so.
Exactly. Your mother said that you're all that she had left.
Exactly. My happiness was paramount to her.
Though you also believe that the defendant could be controlling, right?
She could be, you know, when I went to college, she would bring snacks every weekend and ask who I was hanging out with, but she's grown out of that over time. I'm not her 8-year-old boy anymore.
So that's a yes to my question, Mr. Soto, that your mother could be controlling?
In the past, yeah.
You would also agree that she can take things too far?
Sometimes, but nothing like this.
Well, I want to talk to you about your rehearsal dinner. That evening at 10 p.m., the defendant gave Mr. Petrillo, your fiance, a bottle of wine, right?
Yes, my mother did.
Bottle of Cara wine?
Yes, it was a new vint of wine. I was so surprised. It felt so genuine for my mother.
You'd never seen this bottle of Cara wine before, right?
No, I had heard that it was on the up and up, but I'd never seen it, no.
Then you saw Mr. Petrillo pour a couple of glasses.
Yes.
One glass was for Mr. Petrillo?
Yes.
It wouldn't be the first time that you saw Mr. Petrillo pour 1 or 2 glasses for himself, right?
Yeah, but not at the same time. It would be one glass, drink the glass, pour the second.
And after you went to bed, Genesis planned on drinking more Cara wine. Isn't that right?
I don't know. I told you I was exhausted from the day. I really
Objection,
don't.
Your Honor. Speculation.
What's your response?
Your Honor, this is based on the witness's rationally based perception that Mr. Petrillo was going to drink more wine. It's not speculation.
Your Honor, unless the Mr. Parak can lay the proper foundation that he heard these statements, Mr. Soto cannot go into the mind of Genesis Petrillo planning to drink more wine.
All right, I'm going to sustain your objection for now, but you can lay the foundation if you can, Mr. Parak.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Soto, Mr. Petrillo poured a couple of glasses. Isn't that right?
Yeah, he poured 2, though I don't know who the second was for.
And Mr. Petrillo drank the first glass.
I saw him start to drink, yeah.
And then before you went to bed, you started on that second glass. Isn't that right?
No, I don't know that I ever saw anyone drink out of that second glass.
Mr. Soto, you drank from the first glass, right?
Yes.
Now, I want to talk now about the defendant's relationship with Mr. Petrillo. You would agree that the defendant never got along with Mr. Petrillo, isn't that right?
It was a bit of a rocky relationship, yes.
He opposed your relationship with Mr. Petrillo.
Are you talking about my mother?
Yes, sorry. She opposed.
She was not a fan at first. Again, the snarky comment about the wine, but eventually we came to an even playing field on the issue.
Mr. Soto, your mother opposed your relationship with Mr. Petrillo. That's right.
Yeah, again, she wasn't the biggest fan, but she understood that it wasn't her decision to make.
The defendant tried multiple times to cancel the wedding, didn't she?
Yes, but when we didn't cancel, she came around to realizing that it was best to do what was best for me.
Well, Mr. Petrillo, this was after you told the defendant that you and Mr. Petrillo were planning on moving to France, isn't that right?
My mother had found that out, yes. But I don't know, when you use the word after, I don't know what was after what, but we had found that out.
And when the defendant found out that you were moving to France, she told Mr. Petrillo, Casey has to stay in Midlands. Whether you stay with Casey, move off to France, or end up 6 feet under, I don't care. Isn't that right, Mr. Soto?
My mother can say things she doesn't mean when she's angry, but she did say that.
So that's yes to my question. She did say
yes.
Thank you, Mr. Soto. No further questions, Your Honor. I pass the witness.
Anything further from Mr. Soto?
No redirect, Your Honor. I should ask my witness to be allowed to step down.
Yes, you may. Thank you, sir. Are there any further witnesses for the defense?
Yes, Your Honor, at this time, the defense calls Harper Martini to the stand.
Okay, Ms. Martini. May proceed.
Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the court? My name is Harper Martini. What do you do for a living, Ms. Martini? I actually own Peony Estates here in Midland. Could you tell us a little bit about Peony Estates and how it got started? Yeah, well, I've been around wine my entire life, which isn't the best way to describe your childhood, but my grandparents were in the industry, my parents were in the industry, and I followed in their footsteps. Now, Peony Estates is a winery, a bed and breakfast, wedding venues, you name it, we probably do it. Now, do you run Peony Estates all by yourself? No, it's actually myself, it's Austin Lewis, and Drew Matsukas. The three of us, we are dedicated to our mission of delivering good experiences for all of our guests. Ms. Martini, are you familiar with the events of June 8th, 2019? Yeah, it really was so sad hearing about Genesis. I've never seen Casey that heartbroken before. Who is Casey? Casey's my son, and Genesis was his fiance. They were supposed to be getting married on June 8th, 2019, excuse me. Can you tell us about how Casey and Genesis met? Well, Casey and Genesis met in grad school, and Genesis had come around the winery a few times, but I really didn't know that they were together until Drew was helping Genesis plan the proposal. Now, did you know Genesis personally? Yeah, I had met Genesis a few times. Now, I'll be honest, we didn't really get along, but he made Casey really happy. I had to come to terms with that, but I did have some concerns. What were some of those concerns? I really questioned whether or not Genesis was a good influence on Casey, whether he was really devoted to Casey. I figured someone like Drew would have been a much better fit for my son. They were actually best friends and they even dated back in the day. Oh, I want to move on and talk about the weekend of the rehearsal dinner. How did that weekend start for you? Well, it started with Casey and I sharing a glass of wine together on June 6th. It was a really good night. What did the two of you talk about? It was the nitty gritty of the wedding, the napkins, the tablecloths, the finishing touches on the food. But it was that conversation that made me realize just how badly I needed to bury the hatchet with Genesis. Did you bury the hatchet with Genesis? I did my best to. Yeah, that's actually what led into June 7th, 2019. Can you explain what you mean by that? Well, earlier that year when Genesis had come around for wine tasting, I remember what kind of wine he liked because it was so unique. And Peony Estates was coming out with a new blend that was pretty similar. What blend are you referring to? It's called Cara. It is a 3-1 wine with some really nice fruitful notes. I figured who better than Genesis to give the first bottle to as a peace offering of our new relationship. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the rehearsal dinner, Ms. Martini. Did you give that bottle of wine to Genesis? I did give that bottle of wine to Genesis later on in the night. I had gotten it from the bottling area earlier, and I had put it in the kitchen until it was ready. When did you give her the wine? Give him the wine, excuse me. It was around 10 p.m., around our second toast. I was just so moved by everyone talking about their families. And what did you do after you gave Genesis the wine? I went ahead and I excused myself. I had other matters to take care of at the winery. Ms. Martini, do you recall who Genesis was with that night? They were mainly with Angel and Drew. They were around the venue drinking some. I felt bad for Drew. I really did. Why do you say you felt bad for Drew? Drew's behavior after Genesis proposed confirmed what I always had a suspicion of. Drew still had feelings for Casey.
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation.
Your Honor, this witness has just said that they believed that Drew still had feelings based on their behavior. And I'm about to, if you'll allow me a little leeway, go into what behavior specifically she's referring to that led her to make that conclusion. It's within her rationally based perception.
Your
Okay,
Honor, may I-
yes.
Your Honor, while this witness is free to testify to any specific behaviors that she observed, her statement that Drew still had feelings for Casey is a statement that delves into the mindset of Drew Matsukas and is a statement of speculation. We request that that be stricken from the record, even if they do go on to state behaviors by Drew Matsukas.
Okay, I'll sustain your objection, but you can go in to lay any foundation for a rational basis that the witness has.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Martini, what behavior of Drew's led you to believe that? Well, after Genesis proposed to Casey, Drew picked up a lot of extra shifts at the winery. You know, he'd stay back and clean some, or he'd take more tours around the winery, just found something to really occupy himself. Ms. Martini, was there anything else that led you to feel bad for Drew? Yeah, the night before, I ran into Drew on the bottling area during closing, and it seemed like he may have been crying. Did you interact with Drew at this point? Of course. I asked what he was doing there alone, what he was doing there so late. He quickly turned around, and there was a bottle of Buzz Off at his feet, and the bottle of Carl wine was on the table right in front of him. You know, not all my employees know the protocol. We don't keep pesticides that close to the wine. So I kindly reminded him to please dispose of it before he left. And when I went to go grab the car the next day, the Buzz Off was gone. Ms. Martini, I want to go back to the night of the rehearsal dinner. Did anything happen after you went to bed? I got a call from Austin Lewis around 2:30 in the morning. Why was he calling you? He said that someone from Peony Estates had been rushed to the hospital. Now, my suspicion was that it was one of the wedding guests, so I went and checked all the rooms in the venue. Who had been rushed to the hospital? It was Genesis Petrillo. I was afraid that he had suffered from food or alcohol poisoning. You know, he was drinking quite a bit. What makes you say that, Ms. Martini? Well, when I went into his room to check on him, the bottle of Cara I had given him was on the ground. You know, I was so frustrated that I threw the bottle away. You were frustrated. Why were you frustrated? I was trying really hard to bury the hatchet with Genesis. And this was my son's special day. He'd only get one of them, you know, and Genesis would find a way to ruin it. Oh, Ms. Martini, are you aware that the bottle of Cara wine that Genesis drank from later tested positive for the presence of pesticides? I am aware of that, yes. Do you know why that might be the case? No, I mean, the only thing I can think of is maybe the dumpster. I mean, that's where we had empty cans of pesticides from a sweeping a few weeks earlier, and the dumpster is where the bottle of Cara wine ended up once I threw it away. Ms. Martini, where did you keep that bottle of wine before you gave it to Genesis the night of the wedding? It was in the bottling area. Is this the same bottling area where you saw Drew the night of the rehearsal dinner? I mean, we only have the one bottling area, yeah. Ms. Martini, did Drew know that that bottle was intended for Genesis?
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. Again, this is asking the witness to delve into the mindset of Drew Matsukas and what he knew.
All right, I'll sustain the objection, but if you can ask it in a way that shows that she has personal knowledge of the answer, then allow her to answer.
Ms. Martini, had you told anyone else that that bottle was intended for Genesis? Well, since it was the first bottle from that cask, I let all of my employees know that it was for Genesis, and no one tried to sell it.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay.
Which statement are you objecting to, counsel?
That the defendant said she let all of her employees know that the bottle was for Genesis. This is an out-of-court statement made by the witness who is testifying right now, and it is inadmissible.
To respond.
Your Honor, it's already been established that this bottle was intended for Genesis Trio. We're not using this for the truth of the matter asserted, merely just to show the effect that this had or the effect this could have had on Drew Matsukas on being aware that this was for Genesis Trio.
Your Honor, yes, Your Honor. First of all, this is still being used for the truth of the matter in that it was intended for Genesis Petrillo. Second of all, just because she said it, they are still not allowed to speculate as to what Drew Matsoukas was aware of. And so the speculation objection still stands as well.
Okay, I'm going to overrule both objections.
Ms. Martini, I'm going to re-ask the question. Did Drew know that that bottle was for Genesis? I mean, all my employees knew because I told them. Ms. Martini, finally, would you ever hurt Genesis on purpose? No. I love Casey, and Genesis made Casey happy. I'd never do anything to jeopardize that. Thank you. Pass the witness.
Cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Good morning, Ms. Martini.
Good morning.
I want to talk to you about your knowledge of pesticides. You're aware that pesticides can be extremely dangerous?
Yes, and it's really important that we be careful.
You've actually seen what happens when someone drinks wine with pesticide mixed in it.
Yes.
You saw that the wine with pesticide in it, you couldn't see the pesticide, could you?
I couldn't, no.
You couldn't smell the pesticide in the wine?
No.
And you were also aware that Genesis Petrillo enjoyed drinking fancy blends of wine, right?
Yes, that's actually why we prepared that first bottle just for Genesis.
Well, let's talk about that wine that you gave to Mr. Petrillo. He was the only one to receive the Cara wine.
Yes.
Everyone else in the wedding party received a different bottle, right?
I gave them Horizon, that's correct.
And after you gave Mr. Petrillo that wine, you said that you excused yourself to go to head to the winery, right?
Yes, my job for the night was done. You know, I had given out all the wedding favors. I really had no other place at that rehearsal dinner.
And then you learned that someone from your winery had been rushed to the hospital.
Yes, ma'am.
You thought it might be Genesis Petrillo, right?
Yes.
No, you didn't call the hospital to find out if it was Mr. Petrillo.
No, I figured it'd be quicker if I just swept the rooms and found out who was missing.
So you actually went to Mr. Petrillo's room, didn't you?
I did.
You saw that he wasn't there.
Yes.
You still didn't call the hospital, did you?
No, I don't think they would have given me that information anyway.
But you didn't even try to call the hospital.
No, ma'am.
And then you went into Mr. Petrillo's room and you picked up the empty bottle of Cara wine, right?
Yes, he had probably drank all of it.
But again, you picked up the bottle.
Yes.
You ripped off the label from the bottle, didn't you?
Yes. Like I was saying, I was just so frustrated at the whole situation.
Ms. Martini, that's a yes. You ripped the label off of the bottle?
Yes.
And then you took that unmarked bottle and you threw it in the garbage, didn't you?
I did.
Now, Ms. Martini, I want to talk about why you did that. You didn't like Genesis Petrillo prior to June 7th, did you?
That's right. But I really was trying to bury the hatchet after I talked to Casey about it.
You had actually threatened him multiple times prior to the wedding?
I wouldn't characterize it like that. I can be a bit melodramatic, but by the time June 7th rolled around, I knew what I needed to do, and that was to make peace with Genesis.
Ms. Martini, I'm just looking for a yes or a no. You had threatened Genesis Petrillo, right?
I wouldn't call them threats, no.
Well, let's talk about what you said. You learned that Mr. Petrillo and your son were moving to France, right?
Yes, Genesis called me drunk one night and let me know.
Is that a yes, that they were moving to France?
Yes, they were planning on it.
That made you furious, didn't it?
It did make me upset.
So you called Mr. Petrillo and told him there was nothing you wouldn't do to protect your son?
Yes.
You told him there was nothing he could do to save himself from your wrath?
I did say that, but like I said, I can be a bit melodramatic.
Let's talk about the second time that you threatened Mr. Petrillo. Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff will be screen sharing Exhibit 24. Ms. Martini, this is a note that you wrote to Genesis Petrillo.
Yes.
It looks like a true and accurate photograph of that note.
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff offers Exhibit 24 as evidence.
Any objections to 24?
Yes, Your Honor, I would object to character evidence.
What specifically are you objecting to?
Your Honor, this note was written several weeks before the evening of the rehearsal dinner, June 7th. I believe that opposing counsel is attempting to use this note to establish that Harper Martini hated Genesis Petrillo weeks before when she wrote this note, and therefore she acted in accordance with that character on the evening of June 7th.
What's your response?
Your Honor, we're not offering this for propensity to show Miss Martini's hate on June 7th. We're offering this to show her intent. While this note was given to Mr. Petrillo multiple weeks before the wedding, it states specifically that he has until the 7th to do what is in the note. Your Honor, that is directly relevant to the intent and is not character evidence in any way. It's what happened on the actual occasion.
All right, I'm going to overrule your objection. Exhibit 24 is admitted.
Now, Miss Martini, you told Mr. Petrillo that you wanted him out of your life, right?
I did.
And then you offered him money to leave, right?
Yes, like I said, at that point, I still hadn't made peace with him.
Is that a yes? You offered him money?
Yes, and he took it too.
You offered him a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that.
Miss Martini, you offered him $300,000 to leave, right?
I did.
You told him if he didn't take that money, that you would take him out the hard way.
Oh, no, I said I will take him out of the picture the hard way. You know, I was planning on telling Casey that Drew might still have feelings for him.
So that's a yes. You told Mr. Petrillo that you would take him out of the picture the hard way?
I did say that, and I meant that I would tell Casey about Drew.
Well, you didn't say that you would tell Casey about Drew in this note, did you?
No, I didn't, but that's what I meant by it.
You told Mr. Petrillo only that you would take him out of the picture the hard way. That's all you wrote.
Yes, ma'am, and that's what I meant by it.
And you told him that he had until the 7th to leave and take that money, right?
Yes.
But Mr. Petrillo didn't leave, did he?
No, he did not.
And Miss Martini, you're relieved that Mr. Petrillo is out of your lives forever, aren't you?
I will admit a part of me may be relieved, but what happened was so tragic, and I'm so sad to see my son in this condition. I would never have done this.
Is that a yes? You're relieved to see Mr. Petrillo out of your lives?
A part of me is relieved, but it is still a tragedy.
Thank you, Miss Martini. Your Honor, nothing further. I pass the witness.
Anything further from this witness?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just asked they'd be allowed to step down.
Yes, you may. Thank you. Any further witnesses from the defense?
No further witnesses. I would just request a brief recess before we move into closing arguments.
Are there any rebuttal witnesses from the plaintiff?
No, Your Honor. We also request a brief 10-minute recess.
All right, so are you closing the evidence, plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Parak will actually be doing that. I just came to ask for a brief recess.
The plaintiff closing as well? I mean, the defense closing as well?
Yes, Your Honor, we will be closing. We're fine with the 10-minute recess.
What time is it? Y'all want 10 minutes? What if I give you 8? So it's 12:18 Central Time. Let's get back at 12:26 Central Time.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Let me have a check-in with the scoring judges to make sure that y'all are back from the break.
I'm here, ready to go.
Thank you.
I'm here.
Excellent. All right. Plaintiff and defense, do we have all the parties necessary to conclude the trial?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Mr. Farrak, you may proceed with your closing.
Yes, Your Honor. Remember the threats. Members of the jury, at the beginning of this trial, my co-counsel, Ms. Abia Bakai, asked you to keep in mind one thing as you listen to the testimony. Remember the threats that the defendant, Harper Martini, made to Genesis Petrillo. And now that we're at the end of this trial, let's go through these threats one by one, beginning with the message that the defendant left Mr. Francasio in a voicemail. Someone needs to shut Genesis down, threatened the defendant. I swear, only one of us will survive this wedding. I need you out of our lives, or I will take you out the hard way, said the defendant in a handwritten note. Members of the jury, we know that these were not empty threats, because on June 7th, 2019, the defendant poisoned Genesis Petrillo. Now, as the plaintiff in this case, we have the burden of proof. That means that we need to prove three things. One, that the defendant, Harper Martini, intentionally put pesticide into the bottle of car wine. Two, that the defendant gave that wine to Mr. Petrillo with the intent to poison him. And three, as a result of drinking from that bottle of poisoned wine, Genesis Petrillo died on June 8th, 2019. Now, we need to prove each of these elements by a preponderance of the evidence. Members of the jury, all that means is that we need to prove that it was more likely than not, just 51% more likely, that the defendant intentionally poisoned Genesis Petrillo. And we've met that burden today. So let's go through these elements one by one, beginning with the first element, that the defendant, Harper Martini, intentionally put pesticide into the bottle of 2019 car wine. Well, you heard from the defendant's old boss, Mr. Francasio. Mr. Francasio told you that the defendant was trained several times on the dangers of pesticide. The defendant herself told you on the stand that she knew that if you put pesticide into that wine, well, you couldn't see it. You couldn't smell it. Members of the jury, it was the perfect poison. And that's why you heard from Mr. Angel Rodriguez, an eyewitness who saw the defendant head towards the kitchen holding a can of pesticide, because that's where the wine was kept. Members of the jury, everyone else at this wedding received the exact same bottle of wine, except for Mr. Petrillo. Mr. Petrillo received a special, unique 2019 bottle that the defendant had previously poisoned. The defendant's own actions gave her away. You heard that as Mr. Petrillo was being rushed to the emergency room, the defendant stayed behind. She went through Mr. Petrillo's things, found the empty bottle of car wine, ripped off the tag, and threw it in the trash. Members of the jury, why would the defendant have done that if not to appease their guilty conscience? Members of the jury, that is proof by preponderance that the defendant intentionally put pesticide into that car wine. Next, we had to prove that the defendant had the intent to poison Genesis Petrillo. You heard from the defendant today that she loved two things in this world. One, her winery, and two, her son, Mr. Casey Soto. You heard that it was the defendant's greatest wish to see Mr. Soto take over that winery. And then Mr. Soto went and got engaged to the one person that the defendant hated, Genesis Petrillo. It sent the defendant into a spiraling fit of rage. The defendant became obsessed with getting rid of Mr. Petrillo, no matter the cost. The defendant tried to bribe Mr. Petrillo, saying, "Take this $300,000 and leave, or else I will take you out the hard way." Members of the jury, remember the defendant's threats. Remember that the defendant said that Genesis, miserable, selfish Genesis Petrillo, is getting engaged to his son. That is proof by preponderance that the defendant had the intent to poison Mr. Petrillo. Next, we had to prove that as a result of drinking that wine, Mr. Petrillo died on June 8th, 2019. Well, you heard from Dr. Kwan, the treating physician of Mr. Petrillo, on the night that he came into the emergency room. Dr. Kwan showed you a chart with all of the symptoms that Genesis Petrillo had. Contracted breathing, seizures, nausea, all telltale signs of pesticide poisoning. Now, the defense has called up Dr. Cannon, who talked about liver disease. But the defense's own witness said that that was the least likely cause of death. Dr. Cannon agreed that the most likely cause of death was pesticide poisoning. Dr. Kwan's tests said the same. The toxins test found that in Genesis Petrillo's stomach, there was pesticide and there was wine. That night, Mr. Petrillo slipped into a coma. He died on what was supposed to be his wedding day. Members of the jury, a fiancé has lost their future husband, a family, their son, and we know who's responsible. Harper Martini. She was angry. She was desperate. Remember the defendant's threats. I swear, only one of us will survive this wedding. That turned out to be true. We ask that you find the defendant liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parak. Ms. Avert, are you ready to give your closing argument?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Thank you. May it please the court. On June 7th of 2019, a tragedy occurred. Genesis Petrillo passed away on the eve of what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. That's a tragedy, and no one is denying that, members of the jury. When a tragedy occurs, it's natural to want to place blame, to want to point a finger. It's human. And while we understand that, today's case calls for a more careful look at the evidence, because the plaintiff, they're telling you a story with the wrong villain and the wrong ending. But fortunately, the plaintiff, they can't just come up here and tell you a story. They have to prove something specific to you. Specifically, they had to prove the 3 prongs of civil battery, which are that an act by the defendant, that Harper Martini put poison in that wine, that Harper Martini intended to do that to cause harm to Genesis, and the final thing they have to prove is that that harm, in fact, occurred. And they have to prove each one of those prongs by a preponderance of the evidence. Now, today is not a criminal trial. They have to prove this by preponderance, which means more likely than not. Simply put, is the plaintiff's story the most likely one? Does it fit all the facts? Or is there another story that fits the facts just as well? And that's what we heard today from the defense, members of the jury, another story. Now, I want to talk about the prongs. That first one that the plaintiff had to prove, an act by Harper Martini putting poison in that wine. We heard from a lot of witnesses today, members of the jury, but not one of them saw Harper Martini put poison in that wine. It seems that the plaintiff is confusing their first and second prong. They spent all their time on closing talking about these threats, but members of the jury, they have to prove that an act occurred. It seems that the plaintiff thinks if they just show enough evidence that Harper didn't like Genesis, then that meets the first prong, but that isn't the case. The only witness they could call was Angel, who said she saw Harper holding pesticides, walking towards the kitchen. But let's be clear, she saw Harper Martini in a hallway, walking down the hallway. She doesn't know where. There was no witness called today who could tell you that Harper put poison in that wine. But you heard from Harper Martini that there was someone who was alone with that bottle of Cara wine, that there was someone with motive to hurt Genesis who was alone with that wine before the rehearsal dinner and had a bottle of pesticides with them. And that person was Drew Mazukis, the ex of Casey Soto. Now, members of the jury, Drew is not on trial today. That's true. But the fact remains that there was only one person who was ever seen alone with that bottle of wine and with pesticides, and that person is not Harper Martini. The plaintiff is telling you the story with the wrong villain. Now let's move on and talk about that second prong, intent. They called Danny Francasio, a man who hasn't spoken with Harper Martini since 2015, to try and show you what was motivating Harper. They brought out of context statements that he had not spoken with Harper about to try and prove the intent. But you heard from Casey Soto, Harper Martini's own son, that Harper, despite having a difficult relationship with Genesis, was trying her best to make amends because she loved her son. She wanted what was best for him, which included having a good wedding. That's why she was willing to put those difficulties with Genesis aside. It was for her child. Harper Martini confirmed this on the stand as well. And the only person the defense could bring against this was Danny, a man who hasn't spoken to them in years. Now, members of the jury, the third prong was they had to prove that the pesticide was the cause of Genesis's death. And they couldn't do this either. They called Dr. Kwan to the stand. And Kwan told you that he was certain that pesticides was the case, or that he was certain that pesticides was the cause of Genesis's death. But when we asked him on cross if he looked into other factors or if he looked into other things, he said something, and it was interesting, so I wrote it down. He said, no, that wasn't necessary. Members of the jury, we simply can't know what other factors were affecting Genesis Petrillo that night. But the defense called Cannon to the stand. And Dr. Cannon, she told you that there were other possibilities: alcohol poisoning, liver failure, an allergy. All three of these factors could have affected Genesis Petrillo and led to her death. We can't ever know because Dr. Kwan didn't think it was necessary to look into them. That certainly does not mean it is more likely than not. Every one of the prongs the plaintiff failed to meet by a preponderance standard. They failed to meet it by that standard because the evidence simply isn't there to support it. Members of the jury, the plaintiff told you to remember the threats, but I ask you to remember why we're here today. Finding Harper Martini liable for Genesis Petrillo's death, it's not going to bring her back. No amount of money, it's not going to bring him back. No amount of money is going to undo Genesis's death. That's true. Members of the jury, why you're here is to listen to all the evidence, to give Harper Martini a fair trial. Harper Martini's family has already been shattered by the grief of Genesis's death. Casey has been shattered by that grief. And shutting Peony Estates down is not the right thing to do. People will lose their jobs. And frankly, members of the jury, there's not enough evidence to say that Harper Martini was the one who poisoned Genesis Petrillo. They failed to meet their burden. They're telling you the story with the wrong villain and the wrong ending. We ask that you find them not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Averett. Anything further from the plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor. Rebuttal.
Looks like you have 50 seconds. I'll hold you to it.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Members of the jury, let's think about the evidence that the defense has showed you today. Is it really more likely that some unseen, uncalled person, Mr. Drew Mazukis, who the defense's own witness, Casey Soto, says was with her the entire night of the rehearsal dinner, had the vendetta, the intent, the motive to poison Mr. Petrillo, who he introduced to Mr. Soto? Or is it more likely that Miss Martini, with all of her threats, with all of her rage, was the one who poisoned Mr. Petrillo. We ask that you find the defendant liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parak. All right, I'll go ahead and ask the scoring judges to tally your ballots and let me know when they're submitted. I'll let the tournament know that we're done. After the ballots are submitted, we'll give you some brief comments and you can ask us any questions that you have.
Your Honor, would it be helpful for us to come on screen for the individual rankings? That's what we've been doing in our previous rounds.
Yes,
so I just want to inquire.
That'd be fine. While they're tallying, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Colin Powell. I'm a trial lawyer in Dallas, Texas, doing litigation mostly on the defense side and civil litigation on the defense side. I do a lot of products liability and insurance defense. This was a fun round to watch. I think this is a fun case. I don't know if I'm going to be drinking any wine anytime soon after hearing a weekend full of all of this. But I want to commend both sides for putting on the presentations that they did despite the conditions that we're in. I've judged mock trial for many years, and I've done maybe 3 other competitions this year that have been completely online, and it's just it adds completely different elements to advocacy that y'all have dealt with and done a good job with, and I commend you for that. I think once we get the sign off from our scoring judges, I'll have them introduce themselves. My intent with comment time afterwards is not to keep you for another hour to tell you all the little things that we thought you did wrong, because that's not helpful. So I would encourage my fellow judges to come up with maybe 1 or 2 or 3 things that they think that y'all could use the rest of this competition or going forward to your regional competitions to make you better. That's my intent, at least. So let's give them a minute to wrap up, and then we can get into that. Do y'all know what courtroom number we're in? I have it somewhere, but
3, Your Honor.
Excellent. You would think I would know which courtroom I'm in, but it's just a strange world these days. Okay.
All right, I just submitted my ballot.
Great, thanks, Chris.
I submitted my ballot as well.
Awesome. All right, well, Chris and Aaron, why don't y'all introduce yourselves and then give your brief comments, and then I'll go last.
Sure.
Chris,
Aaron,
start out with you.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Christopher Royce. I'm currently a 2L at Baylor Law School. For those of you that went to opening ceremonies, I spoke there. I'm one of the coaches for Baylor's team this year, and I competed all 4 years with them. So I do want to say good job to all of you. I know that that's not really helpful to hear what you all did well, and so my comment sheet that I just submitted, I just remembered to do that right now, should have more specific comments, but I do just want to do kind of 3 quick general things that I think will be helpful for this specific round. The first one is, I know AMTA kind of changed the rules. I'm not really a big fan of it, but the time. But my kind of way that I think that this should be handled is, I think if you're running low on time, the best thing you need to do is cut things in the middle so that it doesn't seem like you're rushing your testimony as a witness or your questions as a attorney, because I think I could see a lot of that. I mean, I was seeing the chat with the time going, and I could see when you all were speeding up because you were trying to beat the time. I would recommend just cutting stuff in the middle if time does become an issue, because I think it starts to take away from your performance when you're rushing. So yeah, you may have got your questions out, but you didn't really, did you really? So one thing. 2, objections. I thought there were pretty good objections overall, but I think just when you make these objections, you need to be able to be specific about what you're objecting to, and in your response and in your actual objection, give me the rule or the standard that you're trying to do. And so example I'll give is just like when you're doing character evidence, for example, in your explanation, you need to identify what the character trait is they're using for propensity purposes and identify that, right? And I think the best example I have of that is Chandramouli. But did I say that correctly?
Yeah, you nailed it.
Perfect. But the impeachment, the improper impeachment hearsay objection,